All right, everybody. As I mentioned in my preceding video, I wanted to work through these two critical pieces in our first week of reading together. You're not going to be writing about these. I suppose you could reference them, but it's not required. You're not doing them in the commonplace book. What we have is two pieces of reflection on art from the 1960s, from two very different sorts of critics, and we're doing them out of chronological order for reasons I will get into in a moment. So Susan Sontag is an essayist and journalist, a highly respected writer about art and humanities. And she writes this piece, Against Interpretation, in 1964. So an interesting political moment in America. We have the Kennedy assassination, a lot of civil rights protesting and social justice, and some legislative moves to that effect as well. And at this moment, and Sontag wrote about that stuff, but at this moment, she's choosing to write about interpreting art. She offers at the top of the piece a couple of epigrams, one of which, epigraphs, one of which is William de Koenig, who is an artist who says content is the glimpse of something, an encounter like a flash. It's very very tiny content. So you could read content or content, depending. Here, she's writing about content in a specific way, so we want to figure out what that term means. Then you have the Irish writer Oscar Wilde, who notes, "It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances. The mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible." That's worth puzzling over a little bit as well. The mystery of the world is the visible. So this is somebody who was queer and relatively out about it at a time when that was even more dangerous than it is today, who served prison time for a presumed relationship with a wealthy and powerful man. And wrote from a very famous piece of prison writing from jail. So Wilde's visible world was sometimes resplendent and beautiful, and sometimes awful and prejudicial. So Sontag chooses those two quotes to open this essay about art, and then begins to draw a distinction. So right away, she notes that the experience of art as magical versus the criticism of art, the theory of art as mimetic. So thinking about art in terms of how well it interprets reality, it imitates reality. And then this third consideration, the value of art. So art as a magical experience, theorizing art as how well it corresponds to reality, and then judging the value of art based on mimesis, based on how well it interprets, imitates reality. So this piece, and hopefully you've all read it now, by and large, is working from the idea that art needs to be defended. And what it needs to be defended from varies. I mean, this continues today, right? We just had a Super Bowl halftime show that aroused a lot of controversy, I guess, excitement from some quarters, and the need to defend it as art. It can be a political statement, it can be a lot of things, but at the end of the day, it needs to be artistically pleasing, or it fails. So Sontag writes about the way in which a defense of art requires separating form, which is thought to be accessory, meaning secondary, and content, which is thought to be essential. And we are stuck with this task of defending art and artists um, based on their content and how it is interpreted. So when Susan Sontag writes that she's against interpretation, she's talking in a very specific way. Interpretation as finding rules, as needing to translate artistic work, as seeking a code. So looking at art as something to be decoded. And she sees this interpretation as reactionary and stifling is the word she uses. So she talks about the revenge of the intellect upon art, meaning people, I guess, like myself as a literary critic, who bring interpretation to art to find different sorts of potential meanings and then decide which of those meanings is most compelling or useful or interesting or maybe even beautiful. So she is against forcing meaning onto an artistic object. We are in a class together on American literature where we are reading a bunch of artistic objects, and I give you this Sontag piece just to consider the extent to which we are or are not forcing meaning on them. So when she herself is a critic, and so when she notes that interpretation indicates a dissatisfaction with the work, a wish to replace it with something else, that's a pretty nasty charge of art criticism, that you're looking to replace what is in front of you with some deeper, better interpretation thereof. That we would read a story and we would insert ourselves into it in a way that we come away with some new meaning, regardless of whether the artist intended it, and in her view, ignoring what's actually on the page in front of us. I think that's something we should try to avoid, particularly when we're reading things from the 19th century that could be very much divorced from our historical context. But if it's good art, it should speak to us in some way anyway. So what is it Sontag wants us to look for instead? Form. For one, how is this piece built? What is the logic of it? Why is it beautiful or ugly? How does it impact us? What are the pieces, the components within these stories that have these impacts on us? She looks for criticism for what she calls accurate, sharp, and loving description. So to Sontag, and I think this is something we should consider in our class, being able to describe a work of art is itself an end. It's worthy. And then transparence, she talks about, which sounds kind of mystical, experiencing the luminousness of the thing itself. That the way in which the work, again, moves us, what is it about it that's beautiful? What is it trying to do? What are its intentions that we can tell? And how is it successful or not at that? So she says, we read for how it is what it is, not what it means. And I am very wary in my own work of asserting meaning onto something that isn't there. We need to avoid that. So Sontag thinks we do not need to further assimilate art into thought. It's a separate thing. In our own thought exercises here, I would like to be as artistic as possible so that we can meet this work where it is. But her closing statement, which is a very famous one, is also something to think about because I think it's easily misunderstood, right? Show how it is what it is, even that it is what it is, right? So we're talking about American literature and trying to figure out how it is that that is. What does this 160 years of fiction tell us? What is it? And then this very lofty statement, in place of hermeneutics, a term you may not be familiar with. Hermeneutics just means interpretive science. It is, again, rules and codes and ways of interpreting and understanding source material. Sontag looks to replace that with erotics. So that word to us might sound like sexy stuff, and maybe it is. But what she means is something about the desire for art, the desire of art. how it moves us in a bodily way. On the flip side of that coin, then, we have James Baldwin, who is a great American writer of fiction from the mid-century, also queer, also persecuted for it as well, but in a very different way than Wilde. Baldwin escaped and went to Europe for many years, to France in specific, where he could live a bit more freely than as a black queer man in America in the middle of the 20th century. And then ended up returning later in life feeling like he had a responsibility to do that. This piece I don't want to add much to. It is a strange piece of work from only a couple of years earlier than Sontag's, where Baldwin is talking about the way in which the artist must be alone and the role of art to make the world a more human dwelling place. So it's a pretty heavy burden he places on the artist, himself being one. He writes that the artist is present to correct the delusions to which we fall prey in our attempts to avoid the fact that birth, suffering, love, and death are extreme, universal, and inescapable. Birth, suffering, love, death. The themes of all art, perhaps. They're inescapable in life and inescapable in some ways in artistic production. I think safely all of the things we read in here will deal with one or more of those realities. So what does it mean to correct delusions about those? What are the delusions about those? And one of the things Baldwin wants to make sure that we remain aware of are the assumptions we make about traditions, as he puts it, that have existed from the beginning. And in Baldwin's time, again, as a black man in America in 1962, those traditions include racism, misogyny, homophobia, and the false presumption that those things are inevitable and have always existed and will always exist. So when Baldwin gets to his own conclusion about the artist's relationship to society as a lover's war, that sounds like an erotics again. And it's something I want us to think about. Read this piece closely. See what you take away from it. I don't want to offer too much of my own interpretation, honestly. Just like Sontag said not to. But figuring out what this thing is that James Baldwin has written. And then we'll come back to read more of his work later in class. So a little bit of guidance from me to you on these two pieces. And I look forward to how we can apply this stuff to reading some much older material immediately in this first week.